Before we get back to talking about boards, I want to honor a board that is very close to my heart. And to help me do that, I'd like to welcome the Vice President of TCG's board and the Co-Artistic Director of Penumbra Theater Company, Sarah Bellamy.
We've had a lot of wonderful discussion about boards. I'm here to introduce you to a very important group of people at TCG, a collection of theater leaders of which I am proud to be a part. TCG's Board of Directors is a collection of artists, managing and artistic leaders, theater trustees, leaders from outside the field, and above all, passionate advocates for TCG's vision of a better world for theater and a better world because of theater. At every board meeting, I'm inspired by the depth of thinking and diversity of experience that's present. Could all of the TCG board members in attendance please stand so that we can acknowledge your service? As a proud contributor to TCG's governance, I'm here to say on behalf of the entire board, we're here to represent you and advance the issues that matter to you, to support the work of your theater, and to strengthen the movement we all share. So let us hear from you, both today here at the Fall Forum and beyond. Thanks so much. Kevin?
All right, thanks, Sarah. Before I turn the mic back over to Cathy, I want to share another related finding from TCG's research, this time from our governing board survey. And by the way, you all have copies of the governing board survey and theater facts on your table. It's all right there on your table if you want to reference those at any point. When asked in the governing board survey, what are the obstacles to board development, 69% of theaters report lack of board time and 68% cite lack of staff time. Only 27% report disinterest as an obstacle. So as we think about putting what we're learning into practice, it's useful to consider that for most boards, the interest is there if we can only find the time. So let's make some time right now and welcome Cathy back to the stage.
Okay, so one of the things that we were saying before is if you might want to be with some members, are you kind of like, if you're others from your theater or here, you're sitting together, or you all sort of, you kind of manage to move a little bit. I know asking people to move once they got their seat, really challenging. It's like, board meetings where, that's my chair, right? So stay with your turf. But hopefully it's not absolutely essential, but we thought it might be kind of fun for this next exercise if you're seated with some of the folks around the table from similar organization. So, what we're going to do next, and like I said, we will have time before we actually conclude, and I turn into a pumpkin at 12:30 and head out of here. I wish I could stay for the rest of the day, but we're going to do an exercise, we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to allow some Q&A. So there will be some time to ask me any burning questions that you have that you don't mind asking. A lot of people came up to me with the break to ask me a question they didn't feel comfortable saying in front of everyone, but so if there are questions, have those in mind for a little bit later. We will have time for that. So I just want to let you know. Now, what we're going to do next is, if I can advance this, there we go. At our board, at our little tables here, we are going to pretend that we're the board of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And the executive director has come to you, board, and said, should we lend 21 Monet paintings to the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas? Now, I don't know if anybody knows, but the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas has an incredible art collection of its own right. I've never been there, but I heard it's amazing. Right? So this is not a stranger to art, even though we might not necessarily think that you'll find it in that place. And so this is a real life situation. I don't know if anybody remembers it. Certainly a lot of people around Boston do. And it actually made headlines. It made Newsweek and Time Magazine. The executive director was on the cover on this particular issue. Now, in your packets, there's a worksheet. It's got a bunch of lines on a page. And it says, triple helix practice situation. And what I'd like you to do for a few minutes is to sit there and think through, if you were on this board, what questions would you want to raise in the boardroom about this issue? And try to jot down some. Don't worry too much about how long is that. Don't get too hung up on the fiduciary, strategic, and generative unless it really helps you kind of think through questions. But try to jot down some questions in each category as an individual. Then what we'd like you to do is talk at your tables about some of the questions that you came up with. And at every table there's a purple sheet somewhere on your table that's a master sheet. And we'd like you, after some dialogue, oh yeah, like, don't make me write. People are trying to pass the purple sheet around. It's a metaphor for the board, right? Not me, you do it.
Give me that sheet.
I give it out here. You're just going to write your 2 favorite fiduciary, strategic, and generative questions. It's not, you know, it's not a quiz. We're not going to grade you on it. So understand the assignment? All right, so spend a little time thinking as individuals, jotting down questions, and then jump into a table conversation. Where I'd like to get a little bit of sense from the groups, first of all, or some of the tables, we can't go round robin, obviously, about what was the experience like at the table. So did this open up for you a different kind of conversation? Think about a little bit, reflect on your own set of questions maybe that you came up with as an individual versus what the group did. I'd just love to hear some of the reflections about what happened from anybody who'd like to kind of jump in on that. What can we, and if you'd say who you are in your theater, that'd be great too, so we all get to know each other.
My name is Sam Roberson. I'm the artistic director of Congo Square Theater. And I think I think in having the conversation, for me, I'm newly the artistic director, so I just think about our board meetings. And what I try to do is not be simple. So this idea of like, oh, it's as easy as like, how much does it cost? Like, that's not really, yes, that's an easy question to ask, but then behind that, what does that actually mean to me? When I ask how much it costs, that's like the surface level of the question. So I think I kept trying to go deeper into like, okay, what am I really trying to figure out here?
Awesome. I think that's a great way to describe this, going to these different levels of thinking. What am I really trying to figure out here? Sometimes the fiduciary stuff is the simplest stuff. And sometimes it's the first place we go, in part because it's simple. Some people, you know, well, it's the first stuff on the page, so I went there. But you know, what am I really trying to figure out here? I love that. That's a great kind of different way of thinking. What else? Other thoughts about the process or the experience, either as an individual back here or your group?
Hi, Paul Slee, Ensemble Studio Theater here in New York. First of all, everybody dove into this conversation. It was a really great group conversation. And you know, skipping the fiduciary, since you just talked about it, I mean, one of the things was, are we allowed to do this? Are there donor restrictions on the works?
Right. Are we allowed? Are there donor restrictions? Those are basic fiduciary questions.
Yeah, and another great question under generative was, what would Monet say?
I love that. What would Monet say? What a great generative question. We have a hand up over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Marana Zukaminski. I'm from the Seattle Repertory Theater. We started with fiduciary, sort of inevitably it felt like, but as we kept going, the conversation got more complex. And when we called back to the mission to give access to the world, access to this art, and started to get into more complicated questions about who is the community, who is the demographic, are they going to have programs for the immediate Las Vegas community, or is it just Bellagio patrons? That's when the table started to really heat up, it seemed like.
So, just thinking differently, you know, like you said, the table kind of turns. And, you know, it's that prism kind of effect, or the kaleidoscope effect, thinking differently. Incidentally, what they did was they did have school groups in Las Vegas, little kids. They made this an educational session. They got to come through and talk about Monets. They're realizing that those kids in Las Vegas would never have experienced Monet otherwise perhaps, and certainly not 21 of them. If those kids, and any of them had gone to Boston, they probably weren't going to go to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to experience the Monet, so that was part of it. They did make it educational. What else? Yes?
Hi, Tennille 70. I'm from Naples, Florida, on the board of directors for the Gulfshore Playhouse. And I just wanted to talk about the experience at our table, because we don't know each other, but yet every person at this table had the ability to transform to a board member at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And suddenly we all took ownership of this museum, and we were really engaged as if we cared about this museum, what was in this museum, and the reputation of this museum, and we're not. So I just wanted to say, like, you know, critical thinking and the ability, right, to put ourselves in their position. It's wonderful.
That is so awesome. I think that is a great learning. Thank you for saying that. This is not your world necessarily, and yet, talk about a cool case study. All of a sudden, it became your world. Critical thinking. Every single person on your board is capable of critical thinking and a different kind of dialogue if we just let them around a host of issues. And just think about when it's actually issues-facing, when it's actually critical, when it actually matters to your theater. Think how powerful that is, so thank you. So cool. What else? Yes.
Will Coon, Zach Theater in Austin, Texas. Following along with that, it's also interesting that having a table of 10 people, you think it's easy to hear everybody. And it actually can be very challenging to listen and make sure that everybody's viewpoint is being represented. And I think about that in the context of our board, which has about 50 people, and it's challenging at a table with 10, magnify that, and it's something you have to practice actively listening to everybody.
Good point. We do have to practice actively listening to everybody. And I recommend if you've got a great big board that you do breakout groups. You know, it's like go into tables of 10 for this conversation. And then we'll talk about it. You know, let them get into smaller groups to have different kinds of conversations, because it's tough to do it with 50, 60, 70 people. Other thoughts about the experience? Or some of your fabulous questions?
Pete Miller from William in Washington, D.C. I found it interesting around the table that there were probably 4 questions that sort of encoded "we shouldn't" for every question that encoded "we should." And I'm curious whether it's a similar ratio around the rest of the room.
Was there kind of like an embedded "we should" or "shouldn't" within the question? So even though we've said,
like the question, how would this harm the reputation of the museum?
Right.
You know, that impose
instead of
"we shouldn't."
Exactly. How would this harm our reputation? Instead of what would be the effect on our reputation? Which is an open question, could be positive, could be negative. You could ask, what's the upside risk, the downside risk? So did some of you
we had Kim Jennings at Children's Theater Company. We had a pretty similar thought process, except one of the questions we sort of posed for ourselves, well, if this was for $10 million versus if this for some charitable good where they're going to tour the other museums versus what we're just going to loan it to them, right? And if you actually got that commission, you know, more money made it more palatable somehow.
Right? So how much money? And what could we do with that money to further our mission? Were they going to help us further our mission? Lots of interesting questions. Another comment over here.
Hi.
Sorry.
Michael Robertson.
He's got the mic.
Michael Robertson from the Lark Development Center. What was fascinating for me about the table was, one, what were our roles? We didn't fully clarify them. Whoever touched the purple thing first had to do it. And someone had an idea of how to start the room, but then someone else actually started it. So it was fascinating. And the other thing which I thought was really great, that even this exercise at sort of committee meetings would be interesting, is you're not talking about theater, so it takes you sort of a different level of conversation. But there was vocabulary around our table. What is internal mean? What is external? Are donors internal or external stakeholders? So we didn't take the time to define, but there was a lot of conversation around the vocabulary we use, outside of what is generative and what is strategic and what is fiduciary, a little bit of challenge with sort of differentiating some of those things. But I think the board actually having a universal vocabulary about how you talk about stakeholders, how you talk about risk, how you talk about opportunity is really key. So it's interesting because I think we got around to understanding each other, but we're not always using the same terminology. So that was fascinating to me. How do we educate our boards to educate us on how they want to talk about things? What is that vocabulary?
Good for you. That's awesome. I think that's a great takeaway from this experience. And I know one board that I've been working with, one thing that they do is at the start of every conversation, they talk about the stakeholders and who we see as those stakeholders are, and they talk about the different words. Words are important. The language that we use and trying to getting on one page around that is really so essential to great governance.
Bob Evans, Seattle Children's Theater. I think what I noticed most is we started like as a group of people and it changed into a group of individuals with clear ideas. Whereas that's how I always say a board meeting is when you're not talking to individuals, it's just like a bunch of people there and it doesn't really matter who's in the chairs. Whereas I really, at the end of this, understood where each person at my table was coming from. And they became individuals. And I think that's why this is so important.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, they became individuals, not just a group of people. Cool. Okay, another one over here.
Stephen Stern of Theater J in Washington, D.C. What was really interesting to me as we began to lay our questions on the table, you could see the bottom line of questions. There was starting to be clusters of them that we were moving towards purpleizing. And as we dealt with what was kind of a bottom line question, then all different facets and aspects of ethics and and practicality and that stuff came out. It was interesting. We could quickly go to what we felt was the pressing, urgent question in each of the categories, but it was only as we examined them as a group that we began to really develop a much richer consciousness of them.
That is perfect. Thank you. I didn't pay him to say that, but one of the things that's so powerful in this experience is to see what's revealed by it. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's the reveal. So it can be any kind of conversation. If you're listening differently, it's not so much just the actual conversation or the questions, but what do we see after we step back from it? The best boards take some space for that kind of learning, to talk about, okay, we did this experience together. What's revealed by it? What's deeper here? It's a little bit of the adaptive leadership stuff and seeing what people really think by creating a space for a conversation where you can take it to a new level then.
Ron Patton, Executive Director, Congress Square Theater. The scenarios that you gave us, what I loved about it was there was a respect. It wasn't, no one said, I'm a leader, or no one talked about their expertise. No one said, you should listen to me because I have 30 years of experience. There was none of that. And on top of that, we were very complimentary when someone came up with something that we didn't know. It was like, yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, what y'all think about that? Except for slot machines, we have a problem. But, and even in that, when someone brought up something to someone that may be trivial, but we actually talked about the slot machine. Like, are we going to be hotel rooms? I don't know. There was no stupid question. There was no, looking at that person like, why are you speaking? And so it was the conduct, there was such a respect that you felt comfortable saying what your idea was. If it didn't agree with someone, but there was still a palatable atmosphere. It was listening and there was respect. And I think that was, for me, it was refreshing. We just were like, that's great. And complimenting one another on what your idea, or whether, even if it was, we shouldn't do it, there was a compliment behind it, like, that's right. So that was fabulous.
Thank you. And that's the difference between, I think a lot of the difference between posing questions versus asserting opinions. Once you get into asserting opinions, it's very different. Like some of the respect could go out of the window, the ability to listen. So this art of asking great questions is essential to great governance. And I'm going to come over here and tell a quick story about this. And I talk about it in the book, and there's a book called, it's a book by Catherine Schultz, and it's called Being Wrong. Being Wrong. There's one by an MD, Robert Burton, called On Being Certain. So the guy's book is on being certain. The woman's book is called Being Wrong. And she is a fabulous writer. I don't know if you've seen it. Actually, the MD, On Being Certain, talks about how our brains are hardwired to believe we're right. When we think something, we are certain of it. And we, even when confronted with evidence that you know, no, you really weren't where you said you were 10 years ago, and you're like, oh, no, that's wrong. I really, you know, you become certain. Our brains are hardwired for that. But I want to say one thing real quickly about Schultz's book, Being Wrong. She talks about how very, very, very difficult it is for us to admit we're wrong, because in part because we think we're certain. And especially when we've asserted our opinion in public. And what happens when somebody, when you assert your opinion, this is what I believe, and maybe it's at a board meeting, and somebody challenges. So let's say, you know, you challenge me and you say, you know what, Cathy, I think you're wrong. So my first assumption I make about the person who challenges me, I'm like, oh, you're just misinformed. So let me give you a little more information, and then right? Human nature. Okay? Now, they prove to me they're not misinformed. They actually know a lot. So my second assumption, they're just stupid. And so you think they're adult, because they still disagree with you. They're not misinformed, but they disagree. So your second assumption is stupid. Now, they prove to you they're not stupid. Actually smart. Your third assumption, evil. And then you can write them off. So it's so perfect. You're either misinformed, stupid, or evil, or all three. So as long as those are our beliefs about someone who challenges us, how open are we going to be? You know, to be. So it's a powerful book, and she walks through all sorts of scenarios, and just like, wow, you see yourself in it. And she starts with a very, you know, asking your husband, who's stopping by the store, to get a pound cake, and he brings home a lemon cake. And you're like, no, I said pound cake. And he says, no, you told me lemon cake. And you get into this argument. We do it all the time. And he really believes you said lemon cake, and you really believe you said pound cake. So it's just so stupid. It's so silly, but we do these things, and we do them with boards all the time. So, moving on.
Hi.
Hi.
Kelvin Deakins, General Manager at Griffin Theater and Spark Leader. What I loved about this exercise was the amount of answers we didn't have. You know, we were given so much, very little information, but no one had all the answers. We all had questions, which led to some sort of discovery for all of us in how we frame this opportunity. So it was great. It was a really good experience over here at this table.
Awesome. And I know one table was actually looking for answers on now they were looking at, all right, so what's the price of admission? And what do they actually do? So they were Googling it. But it's not about answering. You don't have all the information. In this case, you had very little information, which is part of the idea. Now this gets more challenging once you get into your own environment, and you know, different people around the board table have different bits of information. One group brought up the fact that, well, like with many museums, a lot of conversations happen at the executive committee level, and so did this already, you know, happen at the executive committee level, and then they're bringing it to us? My view is, on a really tough issue like this that has those 5 markers of a true triple helix, you better take it to your board before you get too far downstream with it. Because if the executive committee was already entrenched in the answer to this, you know, the right answer, if you raise it up the flagpole at that point for a generative conversation or a different kind of conversation, you're going to get resistance. Staff members are already dug in, they've already invested. Board members are already dug in, they've already invested. That's not the time to run upstream with it. So timing is important in these conversations. But keep that in mind too. And realize that, though, if you're not talking about answering a question yet, you're just generating questions, who has different pieces of information doesn't matter as much. Now, I just worked with a school yesterday before I came here. They have a critical question. They have an opportunity to purchase some land. It's going to be very costly. That could, though, transform the school. Now, they've had a subcommittee working on this for some time, but they realized, having heard me speak recently, we got to have a conversation with our full board about this. What was fascinating in that, as they generated questions in 3 modes and small work groups, was the committee members who have been on the committee for a couple of months studying this issue, maybe a month or so, actually said this was so enriching because it got them off of, questions were raised that they never even thought of. And it helped them backtrack a little bit to say, you know what, we hadn't thought about that, we better think about that. And people that didn't have as much information, didn't have as much experience, were able to raise different kinds of questions that even a committee hadn't thought of. So now they realize they're going to get a much better decision ultimately. So, awesome. Any other thoughts you want to share about, or question, a great question you want to share? Yes.
Cheryl Livingston, Director of Finance at Idaho Shakespeare Festival. I loved all of the comments, and the discussion at our table was very broad and general. But then when we got to pick the 2 questions on each one, it took several iterations to define and interpret what we were all talking about before we could come down to to how we phrased those questions. And another comment as Director of Finance is that at our board meetings, so often it's just a business meeting. We have the agenda and we go through the report, but somebody was talking about stakeholders, risk, and opportunities. And for an arts organization to just have a business meeting, it's really disconcerting. So I am so glad that I'm here and learning all of this and take it back.
Thank you. Yeah, we should be fonts of creativity with our organizations, I would think, you know? We're in a different space, so it shouldn't just be a business meeting. This gets into cash culture and mission and markets and money and all of these things, so thank you. Broadens it, brings it up. I think there was a hand back here, and then up here, and then over here. Oh, we got a microphone already, so you're next.
Rock Schulfer from the executive director of Griffin Theater in Chicago. And the presentation this morning was great, and thank you for that. And I have just a couple of observations and maybe things to add to it based on the years that I've been doing this. And I'll preface it by saying that the vast, overwhelming majority of trustees that I've worked with have been great. But what I've observed about, I guess what I would call when trustees go bad, tends to fall in the not-for-profit theater, at least, specific to this industry, into a couple of categories. The one would be they bring, if they're in the corporate world, they often bring a large corporate mentality, management mentality to a small business. And for example, I had a member of the board in the midst of the Great Recession and we were dealing with how to cut the budget, and the question was, should we reduce the salaries of everybody by 10%, or should we cut 10% of the staff? And he said, well, there's no question, you cut 10% of the staff and maintain everybody else's salary, which might be fine in a multinational corporation with thousands of employees around the world whom he will never meet. But not so good in an organization that has 100 people, 150 people working for it, which would destroy morale completely. The second is understanding that theater is intrinsically risk-taking. I mean, in a way, we talk about risk-taking as something that we choose to do outside of our normal course of activity. The reality is that everything that we do is risky. That's the nature of producing theater. I mean, the simplest example of that is that if we really knew what people would come to see, Broadway would be the happiest place in the world. And the failure rate is 85%. And all they're doing is trying to produce plays that other people want to see. So, you know, ironically, we've been working with some younger entrepreneurs, you know, millennial entrepreneurs who sort of get it. They get it in a way that some of the other trustees don't. So bringing kind of organizational preservation mentality is kind of counterintuitive to what theater is about. The third thing is perhaps the most controversial. you get people on boards who often, because of their position, their power in their regular job, their family, their money, they're not used to being told no. They're not used to listen. They're used to having, putting it in a positive way, they're used to having their own way. And so the listening and learning part is really tough, because when they step out of that board meeting, hey, everybody does what they want them to do. And the final thing, probably the most important thing, and it really gets into the nature of what we do, is that, again, the business model for these not-for-profit theaters, the impulse for the mission really is supposed to come from an artist or a group of artists. And then through communication, the highest level of communication, collaboration, mutual respect, you develop a support system from trustees and staff to support that artistic vision. The point being is that it's not a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's not the staff and the board and the artists get in a room and vote, and that's what we're going to do. It's a little different. And so these are, I think it's important in all of the discussion, and again, there was so much value in all of this, but I did want to go back to the core principle of this business. I mean, it is risk-taking, and it is about an artistic vision and mission. And you can't selectively decide to support that or not support it. You know, you can't selectively engage. So anyway, that's
Thank
it.
you. Comments or questions? Thanks.
Dina Salanow, freelance director and Spark leader. We started with basic questions: how much, right? What's the risk to the art? And then it was interesting. It seemed like many of our questions all came back to the broader idea of what is the mutual benefit between organizations. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that it really linked to opportunity, and us becoming quite opportunistic with what this potential collaboration could be.
What could this open up to us if we looked at this as an opportunity and expand it? As I mentioned, there was some fallout. A couple of wealthy donors on the board actually resigned from the board and took their money with them in protest and their art. And one of the questions that came up as I was going around was, you know, did the board have, I guess somehow they made the calculus that that's okay. They can, you know, we're going to lose some board members, we're going to bring some more wealth on, we're going to bring some new thinking on to the board. But did they then actually, after they did this and brought those paintings back, and before they made a decision to do it again, what did we learn from that? And do we actually measure some of this? So lots of times what you're going to be talking about at your board is actually creating a learning organization. That's, you know, we tried some things, we took some risks. That's by definition what we do. Let's reflect on it. What went well, what didn't go so well? What are the intended outcomes of this course? And what might be some of the unintended consequences of this course of action? And what will we do about that in that space? So I like what you're saying. There's a book, there's an article by, I think it's McFarlane is the name, and it's called Don't Assume the Shoe Fits. I think it's a Harvard Business Review article, but you can Google Don't Assume the Shoe Fits. And the article is talking about business people on nonprofit boards. And, you know, assuming that because you brought them on for their technical expertise, that they're actually, you know, going to be able to help you with that, or you're bringing on this business mentality. There's some challenges around that. My friend Larry Backout, who ran Tufts University for 10 years, said, you know, my board is made up of people who, because they went to college, think they can run one. And you know, he said, that's it. I'm a frequent flyer, so I think I can run United. You know, I mean, really? So there is some of that. When he started at Tufts, that board was actually having the board meetings after the board meeting at a Chinese restaurant, and it was all the power brokers at Tufts. He loves to tell these stories. And they would go and they'd nod nicely with, you know, nice president, new president, blah, 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 and act like, you know, and then they'd go and have the real meeting, and that's where the decisions were being made. So there's also a great article by Chris Argyris that's in the Harvard Business Review, and it's called Teaching Smart People to Learn. And how challenging this gets to your point about, you know, these successful people that we bring on the board, and we want them because they are successful and wealthy and they've done some amazing things in their lives, and we think that's bringing good stuff to the table in addition to wealth. Smart people are the toughest people to teach to learn anything. Because, right? Because defense mechanisms, you know, I'm rich, I'm successful, I'm smart, therefore. They're not used to being able to tell no, being told no. They're not used to being saying, you know what, your behavior in the boardroom is atrocious. You might have run your company this way. That's not how we run this nonprofit. And so the point that Artris makes is once defense mechanisms kick in, you're not hearing anything, you're not learning anything. But the first thing to do is just get defensive. You know, like goes back to what I said about being wrong. Well, you're an idiot, so you know whatever. And there is some of that. There are some huge egos. Chapter 3, I talk a lot about Isaiah Berlin and the hedgehogs and foxes. You might have heard Isaiah Berlin. And David Brooks wrote more recently about this in the New York Times, about boardroom lions and humble hounds. And picture the difference there. You've got the hedgehogs who drill in. They know one big thing. They're successful. That's what they stick with it, as opposed to foxes who are actually self-subversive. And they're looking at different cues and clues, or paying different attention to different things and not just digging in and entrenched. Now those are extreme caricatures, but we have them on our boards and we have some in between. Part of the idea behind this exercise is to unleash your own thinking. Most of us have a natural way of thinking by virtue of what we do by day. So sometimes what I love to do with boards is say, how do lawyers think? And most of you have lawyers on your board, some of you are lawyers. How do lawyers think? Pros and cons, maybe by the minute, by the billable minutes. risk aversion, right? You got to understand the risk. If I said, how does an engineer think? Logically, linearly, analytically, structurally. How does an architect think? Spatially, right? What can we do with this space, maybe creatively? The idea is you want all those ways of thinking to come alive in the boardroom, and be aware of your own way of thinking, because most of us, by virtue of what we do by day or have done in our lives, come to a way that we see the world. And very important in the boardroom is to unleash all those ways of thinking, but also step back out of your own default. Because most of us have a default, and it's going to take us right. In fact, some of us will have a default for generative, strategic, or fiduciary. We kind of just go there, we gravitate to that. What the idea here is to train your thinking in other ways, push your thinking. Somebody once asked me, it's funny because I grew up in Iowa, but I hadn't thought of it. He said, have you ever asked a board, how does a farmer think? And I said, no, I haven't. I didn't grow up on a farm, although I had milked a cow. He said, how does a farmer think? And his point was that a farmer is thinking about long-term sustainability of a plot of ground that's going to feed people forever. Like, wow, that's a cool metaphor, right? That you're thinking sustainability of a plot of ground. So again, unleash your own thinking. Think about the way you think. Think about your default. Thinking about the different ways of thinking in your board, and try to unleash that. This is one technique to help you do that. Are there other questions or words of wisdom? Because we can all learn a lot more from each other than you can learn from me. Yes.
Hi, I'm Leslie Manlin from the Chesapeake Shakespeare Company down in Baltimore. I'm also a trustee, the most absentee trustee of the Millard Play Development Center. What I particularly liked was the piece of paper that you handed us. My artistic director handed me an article about 2 months ago saying brainstorming is the worst possible way that we can go about having discussions. Because what happens is one or two people dominate the conversation, and then everybody else just kind of nods because it's just too much work. But if you hand people a piece of paper and say, write down your ideas, first of all, then everybody has really thought about it, first of all, and they've committed to their ideas, and they're willing to fight for them a little bit. And you wind up with much more engagement and many, many more good ideas. And so I particularly like this because this is the first time that I've actually seen it in action, and I thought it was really important for this to work well. Thank you.
Thanks for noting that. I hate brainstorming. It drives me crazy. I don't like brainstorming sessions. And generative thinking is not about brainstorming. It isn't. And think about the questions you ask and what you give people to do. I'm a big fan of, if you have work groups, if you decide to go into breakout groups, that you give them an assignment. And you assign a moderator and a reporter, so you don't have to waste time deciding, like you did, who's going to write this down, and who's going to, and that you have work products. And so that the group is actually saying, here's our assignment, what we're supposed to talk about and think about, and here's what we're going to report back. So it doesn't just become a free-for-all brainstorming session. Yes?
Hi, Ken Novice, Managing Director at Griffin Theater. I'm here with my board chair so I can bring this topic up. Picking up on what Rock said earlier, Pamela and I have had a number of conversations about the types of questions that come up, that should come up at a board meeting or at a board committee meeting. In other words, do we want to bring to the board meeting a question of, do we want to build 7 costumes for this play or 6? Like the level of the question comes up a lot.
You built off of what somebody else said in the room. And that's a very important skill in the boardroom, is to be able to say, Robert and Sue, said something, and I want to pull on both of those threads and make this comment. It shows you're listening and you're bringing the dialogue to a different place instead of just, it's clear that you didn't listen to anything else that anybody in the room had said. I worked with the board for 1.5 years at a board retreat. I mean, 1.5 years. Oh my God. No. A day and a half board retreat. I do work with some boards over the course of a couple of years because consultants' job is to perpetuate the problem, so they keep having to come But over the course of a day and a half, at the end of the retreat, I was letting everybody, anybody who wanted to say, stand up and say, what did you learn, what's on your mind, that kind of thing. And this gentleman on the board stood up and he said, I've heard a lot of great ideas the last day and a half, but the best were my own, so let me reiterate. And I kid you not, same board, another person stood up and said, I know I've done a lot of talking at this retreat, but I listen best when I'm talking. Keep those things in mind as you go forth to do this work. We have like 2 more minutes for other thoughts or observations, comments.
Kevin Boyardi, Dallas Theater Center. Could you talk about the role of the executive committee? For those of us who have very large boards, we have a tendency to default these types of conversations to executive. Do you advise if that's wise, or would you encourage us to push this to the full board?
Right, so my advice is don't delegate these really messy triple helix 5 indicator conversations just to the executive committee. What you effectively do if you do that is you usurp the rest of the board. So why should the rest of the board care about coming, continue to care about giving to the organization if they're cut out of the really juicy stuff? So I do understand though, with huge boards, you've got to have an executive committee that you could go to. Now most boards that have executive committees utilize that committee to maybe talk about what are some of the issues that we see, what are these adaptive challenges that we're seeing from the vantage point of our various committees, because sometimes it's the chairs of the committees, or for the organization, that we think we should bubble up to a full board conversation, and then how do we want to have that conversation? So they can be a place where you start to just think through the big issues that you want to bring to the full board and maybe how to do that. And that's a great use of an executive committee that doesn't usurp the rest of the board. And then you can think about, how are we going to manage this kind of conversation? You might actually, with the big board, say, what, we have 60 members on our board. We want 20 of you to think as fiduciaries and generate fiduciary questions. We want 20 of you to think as strategists for a bit and come up with, and we want 20 of you to think as generative thinkers for a bit and come up with something. There's different ways to slice that. Or let's, we're all going to stay in that high level space for the time being. But utilize your executive committee as a sounding board, as maybe a starting point, but not the end point and not the deciding point of those kinds of conversations. And most boards actually say the executive committee cannot do certain things. For example, the executive committee can't change the bylaws, the executive committee can't fire the CEO. There are things that always have to go to the full board for those kinds of conversations. And that's probably spelled out in your bylaws. And let people know, this is another thing I found about executive committees, is people wonder what they do. It's like, they're meeting in this dark, smoke-filled room and we don't really know what they do. But the executive committee meets, they should share with the board what what their conversation was about and why I went to the executive committee. In fact, you can actually get an okay from the board to say, you know what, okay, we've heard from you, now we think we want to give this to the executive committee to do a little more work on, and then we'll bring it back. So, keeping that open, keeping that transparency, hopefully that'll work for you. All right, I guess we now.
Yeah.
It's just this, you know, you see the haystack over there? So one of the boards I worked with on this, they said, as long as it's the haystacks, send them to the board. I've always hated those haystacks. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. Just a reminder that Cathy's book can be found for sale at the TCG bookstore by registration. We are going to have lunch now, but before you go, for those of you that are in the Theaters of Color lunch session, please follow Amelia Cacciapero to the Tribeca Hub. Amelia's right back here. And for those participating in the National Theater Governance Task Force meeting, follow Alyssa Moore, who is right back here, to the Murray Hill Hub, where you also find a lunch that belongs to you and only you. Everybody else, lunch is located in the South Lounge. Buy some books, mingle with some spark leaders, and fuel up, because we've got an exciting afternoon ahead of us. Be back here by 1:30. 1:30. Thanks.